All right, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, March 2nd of 2022. We've got a couple questions in the queue here for today. A couple more questions about sliders. We'll talk a little bit more about sliders, default sliders, etc. I see a question about some of the nuances of the exposure management in the app, exposure minimum and maximum exposure set before and after the build for different lineup sets and sizes and things like that. So we'll go and talk about that. And then I've got a question from Dallas in YouTube chat here asking me to elaborate on a comment I made on Monday about the value of realizing some of your expected value more quickly so that it can be reinvested more quickly. So a few good questions here in our queue right off the bat before we get started. As always, if you have questions for me for today's stream, get them into our question queue early. Office Hours channel in Slack, YouTube chat, two great places to do it. And let's get into it. So we got an 8-game NBA slate on tap tonight. Should be a fun one. A lot of value already opening up. We've got golf tomorrow. The better half of the esports week too. I've been playing a ton of League of Legends contests recently, so a lot of fun DFS going on. But anyway, let's start answering some questions here. We're going to start with a question from James. And this was entered into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Been a while since I've announced this or said this, so I think it's a good idea to always remind you guys that there is a link to join the Slack community in the description of every past Office Hours video. So I highly recommend checking that out. If you're not a part of the Slack community, I recommend joining it. We've got a lot of sharp players in there. Always some interesting discussions going on every night. If you just want to celebrate or tilt, it's a great place to do it as well. I also generally pick off the questions to talk about first on this stream from Slack. So if you want to get your questions answered earlier in the stream, join the Slack community, ask your questions in the Office Hours channel. But anyway, enough chatting. Question time. Playing the 222 with 25 max entries, do you recommend in the setting running 150 lineups and pick my best 25? Or do you recommend just using the 20 max in the settings for GPPs? This is only my third time using SaberSim tools because I can see you can only go with 3 max or 20 max or 150 max. Yeah, so the sliders, the settings are kind of set to, I would say, DraftKings standards. And I know FanDuel and Yahoo do some different things with contest sizing. I think DraftKings, at least at the low to medium stakes, sticks pretty much to that 1, 3, 20, and 150 range. FanDuel does have the 222, the 25 max. Great contest, one that I play regularly. I think the 20 max sliders are perfectly fine to use here. If you are using the 20 max, you can just change this number of lineups to say 25 so that you get a 25 lineup pool out. The sliders, the overall strategies for this contest are going to very much mimic the optimal strategy for a 20 max. So I would play the 25. I would say that the 150 max sliders are certainly not going to kill you in this case, right? You can see that really the only difference here is the variance is going to take a jump from 6 to 8. You're going to have lineups that are slightly more diversified, slightly more volatile, probably have a wider range of outcomes possible. Definitely not going to build you bad lineups or unprofitable lineups in any way. So, if you have been playing on the bigger sliders and maybe playing something like this, you are probably perfectly fine. You were probably still playing great lineups, but I use when I play the 222, I typically use the default sliders for a 20 max 10 to 50K, which is about what it checks out as. So cool. Great question. Okay, cool. And then some good questions here from 3 Putts. And I think Shady Advice has stolen my thunder here a bit in the comments. I took a quick glance at Shady's reply to this comment in Slack, and it looks like he is correct. Oh gosh. Okay. I pasted in the question and it pasted in like a million different comments. So let's break this up into smaller chunks here so that I can actually read what's going on here. Okay, so this was kind of a 2-part question. The first part was under the stacking rules, and I know this is kind of a little bit more of an NHL focused question. So let's hop over to NHL. Under the stacking rules, I assume max exposure to a stack type is designed to limit that stack type specifically and has nothing to do with individual player exposures. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. The stack type purely limits, depending on how you set the rule, but that it purely limits the exposure to combinations of players on that team, right? Stacks. I mean, the player exposure is naturally correlated to the stack exposure. There's only so many lineups that you can make with one player while also honoring a stack rule. But yes, I mean, player exposures are not directly affected by stack exposure. So you can also often find something I've noticed just in my League of Legends lineups recently, for example, that when I limited stacks, sometimes that actually can have very little impact on your player exposures, potentially, depending on what you've set. If, for example, there is a player that is just extremely well projected and you've set a limit on his stack, what the builder will do sometimes is it will use all of the lineups in which that player appears along with his stack, and then also use that player as a one-off in all the opportunities it can, where sometimes you actually may not limit your player exposure very much at all if you've set a stack rule. But I guess that's kind of an edge case a little bit beside the point here. I think that the short answer here is that your player exposures are not directly impacted by stacking exposures. So, and then let's get into the second part of this question. I think probably the more interesting part of this question. I'm going to try to copy this in parts here so I don't have the same issue I just did where everything's coming in all at once. Okay, so we'll read this as kind of a couple parts. I've heard you mention on an office hours before that capping max player exposures works in an orderly fashion when building lineups, meaning the player can be in lineup 1, but not lineup 2, 3, 4, and then is eligible again for lineup 5, depending on what the exposure is. But in my experience, it works as noted on the information tab that it states as having the effect on the entire lineup pool. And then this question wraps up with, if you are only running one build and intend to use the top 3 lineups in a 3 max, but also use that same build in the much larger contests, you run the risk of competing against yourself too much in the 3 max. If the top 3 lineups are all stacks from the same team, even though they make up only, say, 20 to 25% of your entire pool. So this is correct, I would say. I'm gonna hop over to NBA. I'll demonstrate it over there just because the NBA build a little faster. I get the question that's kind of like implied here, just the overall thought, but you are ultimately correct. So minimum and maximum exposures here are, if they're set, whether here, right, this maximum exposure, or player by player min and max exposure set before the build, it is iterative in that each individual lineup we will kind of check and make sure that certain exposure rules are being honored. And if we're under a minimum exposure in that current lineup set, that player is entered into the lineup. If that player is overexposed based on their maximum exposure in the lineup pool to the point up until that lineup, we won't use them in that lineup. Obviously, this does get a little bit complicated when there are exposures set for a ton of different players, but that is the general principle of what is going on here. So minimum and maximum exposures are applied to your entire lineup pool, the entire lineup pool that is built, right? They are also applied to your number of lineups, but only to that individual set. So, for example, if we set maximum exposure here to, say, 40%, we will have no more than 40% of any one player in our entire pool of 500 and also in our top 20. But essentially, any other combination of lineups in your pool, it cannot be guaranteed that that player does not show up in more, that there isn't a player that show up in more than 40% of those lineups. So let's build this and see what this actually looks like. And while you're building, I think kind of the point here is, or while we're building, if you wanted that smooth exposure throughout your entire pool, I think there's a couple things you can do. The first is to build different lineup sets where different custom exposures have been set. That can get a little bit tricky if you are insistent on having a unique lineup into every entry. So let me actually, I think I'm going to end up ultimately confusing people if I don't just demo this live. So, that's a bit of a surprise. Maybe that's too rigid of a pool or too low of a maximum exposure to build from. Let's do this instead. I suppose 40% is maybe a little bit too low for a 500 lineup pool. That seems a little strange to me, but let's do this instead. Let's do 60%. and try again here because I want to have a functional lineup pool from which to work for this question. So grab some water here. That was strange. That seems I don't. Maybe it is a pretty tight pool tonight. I know value is pretty concentrated on tonight's slate, but feels like we should have been able to build that way. I guess 40 is a little low for a 20 lineup set now that I'm thinking about it. 60 probably plays a little nicer. Okay. So again, if we can actually just see this, right? If we go 500, right, we will see that there are no players rostered in more than 60% of our entire pool of 500 lineups, and there are no players rostered more than 60% in our pool of 20. However, if we go down to 3, there are players that appear in 2 of our first 3 lineups. So you are not necessarily always going to have a perfectly flat exposure across any particular subset of lineups in your build. So with that said, if you wanted to do that, right? There's a couple different ways to do it. First of all, if you want a flatter exposure throughout your entire pool of lineups overall, what I would recommend doing is doing a little bit more of this on the projection side, right? Ultimately, the exposures is going to be kind of a hard-coded rule that forces certain lineups into your pool, typically at the end of your lineup set, to follow those rules, right? If by default you're getting 100% exposure in 20 lineups to one player and you say you want a maximum of 50, there is nowhere the lineups that don't include that player can come from other than lower SaberScore lineups, which means the lineups at the end of your pool are naturally going to be overweight on that. On those lineups are going to be the lineups that do not include the player that you cap the exposure on are going to be concentrated at the end of your pool. If you want a more even, a more natural exposure to a particular player throughout your lineups, I would lower his projection. So you may still be getting 50% exposure to that player, but you're getting it more naturally throughout your lineups. The other option here would be to handle this on an individual lineup set basis, right? And to instead create, and I feel like we should be able to get away with this. I guess 60 is actually kind of just a tricky number. So let's try 5. Let's say you're building a 5 lineup set, right? And we want no more than 60% for any one player here, right? There's no guarantee that our initial pool of lineups would have just 60%. So we can set this here. And now we have the flat exposure, maximum exposure set within this particular 5 lineup set. The problem with this is that if you're doing this, if you're using this 500 lineup build to fuel multiple different contests of different sizes, you're not necessarily going to be certain that you get a unique lineup into every single contest. There may be lineups that are shared. If this, for example, was our 5 max or our 5 lineup set, right? And then we did our 20 lineup set that was for our 20 maxes. That also had 60% maximum exposure to any one player. It's possible that there are common lineups in between those, right? That may or may not be a problem depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I know some users may be perfectly fine having a shared lineup between a random 5 max contest and a random 20 max contest. Others may not. So, yeah. So I think, again, for the main question here, the exposures, the maximum and minimum exposures you set pre-build, whether it is in step 1 or in step 2 here, apply only to basically these 2 sets. They apply to your pool at large, and they apply to the number of lineups you set here, but there's no guarantee that it's completely flat for any other lineup set. If you want to create sets of lineups where you have flat exposure or a common maximum exposure or minimum exposure across those, I would either create your individual lineup sets, setting your exposures as you go from a given build, or adjusting your projections down to get that result of that exposure a little more naturally, right? So, Okay. So hopefully that helps. And if there is kind of a practical goal that you're trying to get to here, that you're struggling with, let me know. But cool. All right. Sweet. Let's go ahead and keep it going here. And I'm going to bounce up and hit this question from Dallas. He said on Monday stream at the 53:30 mark, I said he focuses, I don't know who we're talking about, but on maximizing return. Oh, this must have been probably shady advice, right? Maximizing return to reinvest as quickly as possible. Curious if you could elaborate on this. Thank you. Yeah. So the idea here is a lot of our contest selection and bankroll management principles are aimed at maximizing your ROI, aimed at maximizing your expected value, right? Playing a wide number of contests to lower your variance as much as you can, but entering your contests entering your lineups into the softest contests that are available, right? With the goal that over the long term, over the long run, you are going to maximize your return on investment of those individual lineups, right? A competing idea, or maybe not one that's directly in conflict with this, is the idea that you can sacrifice some long-term ROI or some theoretical expected value to capture some of your edge and actually realize some of your gains more quickly so that you could reinvest that more quickly, right? It's almost kind of, you may be playing, let's say you play out a slate 10,000 times, or even let's say you play 100 slates, right? And your expectation is that on average, at the end of that 100 slates, you're going to make $1,000, right? Well, if you can instead capture $200, but more quickly and more reliably, it would allow you to theoretically get more action down or maybe rise in stakes more quickly, right? You can only invest more and jump up in stakes as quick as you realize your actual gains. So the argument here is that it makes sense, or it can make sense, to potentially play some smaller contests where you may be up against sharper competition overall, but you have an overall higher probability of winning that contest on any given night, because that'll allow you to win back some of your equity more quickly and reinvest it more quickly the next night, right? Even if you are expected to profit in a enormous contest long term, it takes a long time to actually realize that profit, is the idea. You may have a 20% ROI, at least in theory, in a 100,000 person contest that is packed full of fish. But you have to play that contest many times before you realize that ROI. Without realizing it, you can't reinvest it. So that's the argument here, is that, if you have a 5% ROI in a 5,000 person contest over the long term, you are likely to realize that a little more quickly and a little more consistently. So I think it's perfectly fine for there to be a balance here, but I think it is an overall strong point that if you would like to see gains more quickly, if you are willing to, I guess more specifically, if you are willing to potentially sacrifice pure profitability to see gains more quickly, it may make sense for you to play some smaller contests when you have the choice, right? To realize your gain, your edge more quickly, right? Or to even test a particular process, right? If you are trying something new out, you can realize more quickly if that thing is working in a smaller contest where you are likely to return on your investment more quickly. That's the idea here. So, yeah. Let me know if that helps. I think there can be a balance too. A lot of times my contest selection portfolio on a given night will include some larger contests, some big, like the And One, right? That's a 50,000 lineup contest that has a ton of effective entrants. It's under $3. that contest is in general going to play very softly, right? There's not a very overall high skill level in that contest. My expected ROI over the long term is probably pretty high in that, but it takes a long time to realize that. So I will also often enter some of the same lineups that are in that contest and do a lot of other small contests throughout the night, knowing that my long-term expected ROI in the smaller contests is probably lower because there's a more, the skilled players in smaller contests take up more equity, but I can realize more of it more quickly, and I can smooth out my variance a little bit more quickly, or I can smooth out my variance a little bit because I'll allow myself to have small wins while I'm waiting for the opportunity to realize most of my ROI with a big win of something like the end one. So that's kind of the theory here, at least. So let me know if that helps. But okay. Let's hit the rest of the questions in YouTube chat here. Scott says, any chance tee times can be added to the PGA build page? This could be useful when weather is a factor. Yeah. It is our plan to add that in the future. I know that's a common request. I know it is a bit of a pain to have to go and kind of one by one, like add this yourself or create your own groups just by tracking the tee times yourself. So yes, it is on our list. Brandon says, why is the esports slates just loaded on DK, not FanDuel? We just don't have the short answer is we are not set up to support FanDuel League of Legends yet at the moment. That is also on our list to add. That I think we should have probably by the end of this month, along with, we have the League of Legends side of the app is now hooked up to real simulations, right? Which is pretty exciting, gives you quite a bit of an edge, but it's not all the way there, right? There's a couple things that are missing. You can see we don't have correlations in yet. I guess those are kind of some of the like percentiles aren't hooked up. There's a couple things that aren't done yet. So part of our cleanup tasks for the League of Legends sims is to also get us hooked up on FanDuel. So Dante says, hey, Jordan, will you guys plan to add salary next to the player's name on NBA so I can easily compare the salary to the projection? Also, what value range should I be looking for when adjusting projections? First of all, salary should already be here, and your tables are totally customizable to you. So if you are missing salary, it's likely that somehow that column got turned off in your settings. So if you click this edit table columns here, you can click salary back in, or very easy, you can just clear everything, reset to default, apply, and it'll kind of reset everything. But salary should be here as a column. If you want it next to your projection column, you can move it over there as well. These are drag and drop customizable. So you can make this basically look however you want. You can also turn columns off if you don't need them, right? So you can kind of do whatever you want. The other question here, also, what value range should I be looking for when adjusting projections? It's a good question. So I wouldn't say that most of the time I look at a particular value range. What I typically recommend is I would start with a test build. So get an idea of what the slate looks like. Go in here, build some lineups for whatever contest you're planning on playing here. So maybe it's a 20 max, right? Default settings, you're not going to change anything. And then here, what I typically like to do is look at a few things. Look at the players that you have the highest exposure to overall in your pool. I would say look at how you are navigating the chalkiest players, right? Are you over or under the field on the chalkiest players on the slate? What are your biggest overall leverage stands, right? So, again, highest exposed players. How are you navigating the chalk, right? You typically see, especially for a larger field MME kind of contest, there'll be a couple chalky guys that you're over on, a couple chalky guys that you're probably under on. What are your biggest overall stands from a leverage standpoint? And you can take some notes there and come up with kind of a list of players that maybe you want to spend a little bit more time researching, looking into a little bit closer. And once you've conducted that research and you have some idea, or maybe you don't even research, maybe you just know you want to be a little lower on a player. From there, I like to use 10% bumps of a player's projection to go one direction or the other, right? So maybe, Ayton was really popping out to me. I think Ayton's a good play, but maybe that felt like a little bit of a high projection and you need a starting point to make an adjustment. I like to use 10% because I think it's just I think it's a really strong adjustment overall. as a starting point, right? It won't completely devalue the sims, but it also will it will typically leave an impact. And if it doesn't, right, if you do this and rebuild lineups and it has no impact on it, what that means is that that player's projection is very anti-fragile, and maybe it's just a good idea to leave him where he's at. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily like use the value column alone to determine where to make adjustments to projections. I like to run a test build and kind of use that as a tool for me to get an idea of where the best opportunities for research are. So Jaybird says, is it normal to get a message stating that lineups can't be completed due to the current exposures when you do a late swap build? It can. I wouldn't say it's necessarily normal. It certainly can happen, right? Because when you're late swapping, your lineups are kind of at the whims of what players and salaries are already locked into that lineup. It can make it harder for the builder to find lineups that fit while also maintaining all of your exposures. It's hard to say without knowing exactly what your entries look like and exactly what your exposures are set as. I would honestly probably say what I would do is, if you run into a problem where you are late swapping and you are getting an exposures error for NBA, when you are under the clock and kind of need to get things done quickly, let me get an entries file in here. What I think is probably the best thing to do here, if you have exposures set and you're getting the error, is to reset your exposures using this button, right? These are reserved lineups, so I have no lineups in here, but reset your exposures using this button, then late swap again. Maybe just enter that entries file just so you have that in, and so you're taking advantage of the most recent news, but then look at your exposures in the late swap and see if anything looks out of line, and kind of selectively, like, okay, let me just demo this. Let's just do a demo. So we'll do unique. I have 211 lineups. Basically what I'm describing is you can use a test. You can use a test build when you're late swapping as well, and kind of test late swap, see where exposures sit, and selectively adjust your exposures in the entry editor to get things where you want them to be. So let me show you what I mean. Okay, so I have 211 lineups. And let's just do a random fill here and download. Okay, so these are the lineups that I hypothetically take into lock, and then it comes time to late swap. And I late swap once, right? And I'm getting an error saying that exposures can't be met. Sometimes you can tell what the problem is, right? You may have a minimum exposure set for a player that has gotten ruled out, right? That could be a very common one where the builder's going to say, we can't follow this rule because this player is not even in the player pool. There's other issues that can come up. Again, I would just reset the exposures if you're in a pinch and need to get this done, and then run basically a test late swap with no exposure set. The other thing to remember here is that if some games have already locked, you have, especially if this is as we approach the night slate, for example, you've gotten a lot of the value out of your exposures already, right? A lot of these exposures have already been honored throughout the process. So I would run the test build here, see what you get. See if any players look particularly out of line in these exposures, and then make selective adjustments back in the entry editor and run another swap. So. Okay, so here's your hypothetical test late swap build. Right, I would download this. At least this captures the most up-to-date news. But maybe you look at this and say that was never how much Cameron Payne I was comfortable playing. Like maybe these first three names all look a little high, and you say, I want max 50% each of these guys, for example. They all look like elite plays, but what I would do is then come back here and then say 50%. 50%, 50%, and then run a late swap again with more selective exposures. So, all right. Let's see. Jordan, if you entered a GPP contest that was approximately 1,300 people and 40 entries max or something similar, what would the sliders to use since those numbers don't exist on the sliders? Yeah, I would just use something close or kind of in between here. So 1,300 makes a lot of sense to be in the 1,000 to 10,000 area here. In terms of a 40 max, right? I would probably take an eye on like the 20 and 150 max. So makes no difference to the correlation and ownership fade sliders. Looks like we just have a bump from 4 to 6. So I might do something like this using manual mode. Either the 20 max or the 150 max sliders are also going to be perfectly fine. There's pretty small overall difference in the impact on your lineups. Up at 6, your lineups are going to be slightly more diverse. If you are kind of more comfortable playing a more diverse range of players, exposures, things like that, I would use the higher setting or be more comfortable using the higher setting. If you like having a more tighter core of players, maybe you want to come down here a little bit. But, you know, on these, in general, these questions where you're playing a contest where your sliders don't fit cleanly into the defaults, either the two closest options or something in between will typically work just fine. So Brandon says it was supported last year. What happened? I think FanDuel changed their League of Legends product, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong about that, but I believe that FanDuel has a different League of Legends slate style now. It's also possible that just in hooking up the Sims, that it broke it. It is on our list to fix. And it's not, I don't mean that like we're going to fix it when we get to it. We just put out our NASCAR Sims. We're doing some final touches on the NASCAR Sims. And then we want to come back and do our cleanup on the League of Legends side, including FanDuel support. So it should be Sim. So Dallas said, building off the other question you answered, if you edit projections to meet proper exposures and play 150 in the mini max, would you use rank for the 20 max jukebox and 1 and dime time? That depends on what you are comfortable with. I am okay personally having a tighter range of exposures in my top lineups than I do across an entire set of 150. And I'm also okay playing the same 20, playing my top 20 in 20 maxes and also as my top 20 into 150s, right? So for me, the answer is yes. I think that's perfectly fine. You are doubling down. You are essentially doubling down on those top 20, right? You are getting additional action on those lineups in the form of entering them into different contests. So I guess the question is mostly, is that your goal? Is that what you want to do? Another option would be to use, for example, the unique rank fill, right? So we added the unique rank fill. So you could now instead, if you wanted, for example, right? What I'm typically going to do is take like a 150 lineup set and fill it with the rank fill method and basically spend more to invest extra into my top 20 lineups, right? I'm doubling down on kind of the value of SaberScore here. A more conservative way to do that would be to rank the contests, maybe potentially in order of overall prize pool, I think is a decent way to do it. So you could do something like this and use the unique rank fill. And that's going to put a unique lineup into every contest while putting the highest SaberScore lineups into the largest prize pool contest, right? That is another option. Another option would be to actually just use the unique random fill, right? And basically fill totally randomly. If you wanted to make sure that as best as you can, that your exposures were relatively flat through any one contest, you could randomly fill all of your contests, right? I think that's another way. So it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. I see this follow up here because if you have 60% Luka, he's probably going to be in all the top 20 lineups from rank. The top 20 are going to be very similar, but also the best SaberScore. Yeah, this is a matter of like your own personal risk tolerance. I think there's a strong argument to be made either way. I'm comfortable with this. At least this is the way I've been playing throughout this season, where if I have 60% Luka throughout 150, but 100% Luka in the top 20, I am okay with that. That doesn't mean necessarily that everyone has to be. I think if you aren't okay with that, I think, again, there's a couple different options at your disposal. I think one, using a unique fill, probably unique random in particular, because I think the argument here, right, is if you're not okay with having an increased exposure to Luka in your first 20 lineups, what that is saying is that spreading out your variance is more important than capturing the edge of SaberScore to you, which is okay. That's perfectly fine to say that. If that was the case, I think one of the easiest ways to kind of circumvent that would be to use the unique random fill and say, I don't care so much about the individual Saber scores of the lineups. I want to make sure as best as I can that my exposures to any one player are spread out across the full run of my contests. So that's a very easy way to do that. If you don't want to do that, if you want to still fill with rank and also make sure your lineups still have or your exposures are generally flat or homogeneous throughout your entire pool, then what I would do is adjust with projections, right? So if you want to say, I want 60% Luka and I want any individual subset of lineups from my pool to be approximately 60% Luka, and I want to fill with rank my top overall SaberScore lineups in my pool, I think you would be better off, rather than setting a maximum exposure of 60% to Luka, I would adjust his projection down until you were getting 60%, because you'll get a more natural flat exposure to him throughout your lineups. So it kind of, again, depends on what you're comfortable with, and it depends on what your goal is here, right? There's a lot of different ways you could get 60% Luka in different subsets of lineups of a set of 150 or 20 or whatever, and it depends on kind of what your goal is to accomplish in that set. For me, in general, and this isn't to say that I will always do this. I think this is an interesting conversation and probably something that I'll spend some time thinking about on my own. For me, what I have been doing up until this point of the season is I have been generally like taking a lineup set like this and filling rank fill from a pool of 150, understanding that I may have a much more concentrated set of exposures to any one player in my top 20, and I am also doubling down on that individual exposure set. But I don't think personally that the risk of competing too much with myself in contests as large as the and one and the quarter jukebox is too high. Even if I had 100% exposure to 3 different players in that set of 20, there are still so many lineups in that pool and so many ways to differentiate through the other remaining lineup spots that I'm not overly concerned with being too concentrated on that set of players. So let me know if that helps. Again, I think my goal here is to kind of explain your options to you. But I don't think there is necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer that is going to work for everybody. There's a reason, that we have these different tools to do these different things, and even the different fill methods, right? There are different reasons to use these depending on how spread out you want your exposures to be, how variant you want your lineups to be, and how much you value SaberScore, right? How much of an individual value do you think there is in playing the highest SaberScore lineups in your highest prize pool contests and doubling down on your highest SaberScore lineups? So anyway, another question here. Also, do you usually adjust the min unique slider? What is the effect in smaller size GPPs? I don't. The effect of this, regardless of the size of the contest, is that this particular this is the number of players when comparing any 2 lineups that must be different, right? So when it's set at 1, it means if you built a pool of 500 lineups, if you picked out any 2 lineups from the pool, there would be at least 1 player different, right? If this was set at 0, hypothetically, you can't set it at 0. But if it were, would be duplicate lineups. At 2, for example, any 2 lineups when compared to one another would have to have 2 players differently from each other, right? The way I always describe this is that it is a blunt force tool to force diversity into your lineups, right? It basically tells the builder that there is a restriction on what types of lineups it can build. The reason I call it blunt force is because it is just a builder restriction. If you want additional diversity in your lineups, if you run a test build for a particular contest with default settings and you are looking at your lineups and you think these lineups look too similar to one another, or my exposures to these players in my pool are too condensed, I think a better thing to do is to increase your sim variance slider. And what that's going to do is it's going to mean that every individual lineup you build is built from a smaller set of game simulations, which is going to widen your range of outcomes. It's going to increase your diversity. It's going to increase the volatility of your lineups. So I think it's a better tool overall to increase your diversity because it also increases your upside by looking at those wider ranges of outcomes. The best use case I think there is for using min uniques personally is if you are playing a contest where by default your sim variance slider is already at 10 and you want additional diversity. Your lineups still don't look like they are diverse enough to you. That is the best. So a good example is golf, right? There are others. Showdown slates are a good example as well. But hypothetically, if you were playing large field golf contests, so, something like, contests like this, right? The Minimax, I think this week has 95,000 entrants in it. Tough contest. And you built your lineups, you did your test build, and your exposures looked still too condensed. Your lineups looked like they had too many players in common. You wanted to diversify even more. I would then think there's a strong reason at that point to increase your min unique slider. Or setting, excuse me. Crypto Artist NFT says, when I enter lineups for DK, how do I separate the lineups for other contests? Example, I enter 20 for the 25 cent and come back and enter another 10 for the 10 cent. How can I know which 20 is for that contest? Good question. Okay, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think the easiest thing to do would be to name your builds and name your lineup sets. It makes it a little bit easier to identify what you have going on here. So let's go back to one of these builds here. Or that one is the one we did let's use this one instead. So I guess one thing to note here is so you can rename your builds and your lineup sets in the app, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But you can have multiple lineup sets that all came from the same build, right? So hypothetically here, this is how you rename a build, this little pencil icon. So we can rename this and call this I don't know what we would call this. Maybe this is our final build before lock. And then we can have different lineup sets from this build. So let's say we make a lineup set from here. We adjust some exposures to some of these guys, hypothetically here. And then we save, and we're going to have a new lineup set. If we click this pencil icon, we can call this one quarter jukebox, right? So now if we go in here and we're filling our lineups, we can go to the quarter jukebox, and when we go to fill this, we will have much more clearly the quarter jukebox lineup set that came from our final build. That helps to keep things organized. So let me know if that helps. I think that's kind of what you were getting at here. So, and then another question here. What is the importance of the leverage score when you build lineups? The leverage column is going to tell you the difference in your exposure to any one player versus the projected ownership of that player in the contest, right? So it is going to basically say, what percent of lineups more do you have in your pool than the field does, right? We have 85.6% more exposure to DeAndre Ayton than the field does because we have, of a pool of 20, 95%. And we expect on average 9.4% of the lineups in the contest to roster Ayton, at least at this point in the day. These will change. The ownerships will change throughout the day. So what is useful about the leverage column is it is descriptive of your overall strategy that you're taking on the slate, both in direction and in magnitude. So in other words, sorting by leverage, positive, top to bottom, this list of players should theoretically represent your approach to the slate. you should be able to say that the play in which you are most confident in for this particular slate is DeAndre Ayton, followed by Olivier Sarr, whoever the Oklahoma City Thunder are trotting out there on a night-to-night basis at this point of the season is beyond me, but that's looks like a pretty good value play at mid price. Then Donovan Mitchell, then Trey Lyles, then Wendell Carter. And as a step more, you can take this from the standpoint of magnitude, right? By saying that we are 50% over the field on Donovan Mitchell and 25% over the field on Brandon Ingram, we are essentially making the statement that we are twice as confident about Donovan Mitchell than Brandon Ingram, right? So you can use this, and you can reverse this too and do this from the opposite point of view. Our biggest overall stand on the slate is CJ McCollum. The play in which we are furthest away from the field on the negative side is CJ McCollum. We are completely fading him, and he is expected to be 20% owned. So you can use this as a tool to make adjustments, right? Maybe you say, yeah, actually, DeAndre Ayton is the play I am the most confident about on this slate, but I am not significantly more confident than the next best play here, and I don't even know who Olivier Sarr is. So maybe you say you want to bring Sarr down to 60% of your lineups, right? And you want to bring Ayton down to, say, 70% of your lineups, right? And now you have a more flat, actually, let's say 60% here, right? Now you have kind of a flatter positive leverage on your top end plays. You have diversified a bit here, and you are not, now you stand to gain less now, hypothetically, if Ayton goes off and scores 60, but you are also playing a little bit more safely. You are not as significantly invested into Ayton on tonight's slate. So that's kind of the importance of it. That's the way I would use it. So. Okay, cool. I'm going to jump back over to Slack. There's a couple interesting questions here in Slack. And this one's interesting. Yo, I got this. Said, last night, Satoransky was available to play, but not in DK's player pool. Obviously, that has a real-life effect on other players' fantasy scores. This event is relatively rare, but how do the Sims handle this? I don't know, to be honest. That is a good question. Did he play? I guess that I'm interested to see. What I was going to do as a test is I was going to go back and see. I don't even know what he's on the Wizards, right? I think he's on the Wizards. Yeah. Okay. So we can check. Let's see here. Wait, what? Am I crazy? He's not on the Wizards? The Wizards didn't even play last night, did they? Oh, this is... I see. Here we go. That was tonight's slate. Okay, here are the Wizards. What I was going to check here real quick is to see if the minutes add up or if there is an implied minutes to somebody that's not showing up here. So yeah, he's not even in the player pool. So let's do a quick check. Let's see. I know this is probably a little boring to watch, but I'm interested now. 27.34. I'm adding up the minutes of every player on the Wizards here. The simulated minutes. Okay, so it added up to 240 here, which is, there should be 5 times 48, right? 240. So honestly, what it seems like to me, actually, in this particular case, is that we did not pick up on. So I guess this isn't necessarily a confident answer. I'm going to go back and talk to the models team and Matt about this and see what they think. Because I guess this isn't, it could be possibly that we did pick up Satoransky on the Wizards, but we just didn't assign him any minutes. That's also possible. But the players that are listed here do add up to about 240 minutes. I think I miscalculated somewhere, but makes me think that he was not incorporated into the sim here. If that was the case, this situation could potentially be a good opportunity to add value. I don't even know if there was news about him being in the rotation last night that came out before lock. If there was, might be a good opportunity to tick down some of these other Wizards players a little bit, right? But I will follow up on if we actually capture that in a more general sense for players that are not in the player pool but are playing, if that's captured in the Sims, because I don't know the answer to that. So, okay. Okay. DFStoolkit.com asked if there's any plans to add historical fantasy point outcomes from previous slates. They should already be in there. They're there for last night. We have actual scores in here. I don't think we have much more plans beyond that to add historical stats or anything like that for players. We've talked about that, but it's not really the direction we want to go, to be, I guess, completely upfront. I think there are a lot of other sites out there that offer almanac and like encyclopedic reference information for stats for players. And I don't think that's the direction that we're kind of planning on going. But we do have the actual past scores for players from past slates. So, epic problem, this infinity plan thing. I think this is a bug that you posted. I would post that in support if you're still running into issues there. We'll follow up with you in support if you're having issues there. But Ryan says Yahoo's been running 6K to first the last couple days. Hope they get back to 10K. They like to run bigger contests on Friday. Hope we get that. I wouldn't count on it, man, to be honest. It's that time of year. I think you will see potentially a slow condensing of NBA contest sizing until playoffs. And then there's typically a little boost around playoffs time. No baseball, or at least no baseball to start the season, will be an interesting wrinkle into that in terms of what contest sizing looks like. But I think it's, especially on some of the smaller sites, Yahoo, I think it's probably safe to assume that their contest sizing for NBA will probably continue to go down. So, but cool. Yeah, so DFS Toolkit mentioned SAR isn't in the player pool either for FanDuel. So this is an interesting question. I mean, I'm probably just going to have to ask somebody and get back to you guys on this, because like SAR is clearly projected on DraftKings, and it's not as if we have DraftKings sims and FanDuel sims. We have one sim, and then we update that we turn that into fantasy projections based on the scoring rules for the site. But SAR is in the OKC sim no matter what. My gut, here's what my gut is telling me. My gut is that this is accounted for, and we just didn't project minutes for Satoransky last night, which also still is like a miss, objectively speaking, right? Especially if there was news that broke that that he was going to get minutes. But my gut feeling here is that this is something that's captured in the sims, like we have an understanding of who's supposed to play that particular night. We have starting lineups. We have an understanding of who's on the rosters, and the pathway to transforming that into players in a player pool and fantasy points is a separate thing here. And for last night in particular, we just didn't project Satoransky to get minutes. That is my impression here. But I will ask and follow up on that, because I think that's an interesting question. So, but SAR is a great example of it, where like he's not in the player pool for FanDuel. He is clearly in the sim because he's projected on DraftKings, and it's a single set of NBA sims. So, but yeah, interesting question. Good one for sure there. So, all right, cool. Well, we're right at about an hour here. Okay, so real quick, I got this. We're doing a little bit of tag team detective work here, which I love. Says check FanDuel. They had Satoransky in the pool, but no minutes projection, which makes me think that's basically what happened here. Is that we simply just didn't project him for minutes, so he wasn't in the Sims. So I actually think this is kind of settled, just based on the SAR news. Regardless, if a player's not in the pool, right, we should still understand that they're in the Sims because his minutes are clearly, like, his projection is clearly missing here on the FanDuel side. But I will follow up and confirm. But great question. So, cool. Well, I think we'll go ahead. We will stop there for today. Thank you again to everybody that tuned in, asked questions, watched, participated. To all of you that watch and listen to the show after when I posted it up on YouTube, the recording, appreciate you as well. We will be right back again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern for Thursday. So good luck in your contest tonight. Have a great night and take care. See ya.